Now, an introduction. Professor Fred Woods is a native of Southern California who converted to the church as a young adult. He completed his PhD at the University of Utah in Middle East Studies in 1991. And then, I assume, you went on to teach in the Seminaries and Institutes program. For the church, he taught there for 12 years. He was a professor at BYU, Idaho for 5 years. He's been a professor of church history here at BYU since 1998. His newest book, entitled Go Ye Into All the World, The Growth and Development of Mormon Missionary Work, will be published in November of this year. Fred is a friend of the library. He comes to the library often. He comes to special collections, and I see him quite a bit. In fact, and Russ sees him even more than I do. In fact, he's such a friend, he's going to be giving another lecture here in the library. On Wednesday, November 28th at 4 p.m., he will be lecturing here as part of the series of lectures that Mark Grover is organizing, and he'll be speaking at that time on the topic of finding refuge in El Paso. So that'll be a fun presentation as well. Remember, Wednesday, November 28th. So now let's please welcome Professor Woods as he officially opens our exhibition of Voices of the Civil War, Evidence and Artifacts. As I say, it's an official opening, but as I noted 5 minutes ago, we've already had 3,000 visitors. So since it's unofficial opening during Education Week. Fred will be talking to the topic that you see, Mormon migration and observation to and through Utah during the Civil War. Let's please welcome Professor Woods.
Good afternoon. It's great to be with you. I wanted to thank Russ for his prayer and all the help he's extended to me over the years, and Scott for his kind introduction. I feel honored to be able to launch the first lecture as this exhibit's opening up, Voices of the Civil War. And today we're going to be talking about voices of Latter-day Saints during the Civil War, and to try to just focus on this brick in the wall. Scott mentioned earlier Gettysburg and the number 3,000. I was just sitting there thinking that I don't know of any other topic in American history that's been written about more than the Civil War. And in fact, there are over 3,000 books written on the Battle of Gettysburg alone. And so this is quite a topic, and it's very timely that we would be talking about this during the time when our nation is celebrating, during this season, the sesquicentennial of the War of Rebellion. As you see here, E.B. Long released his book, Saints in the Union, over 3 decades ago, and although he touched a paragraph or two on immigration, there's a tremendous need for this, and I'm grateful that Civil War Saints, edited by Ken Alford, one of my colleagues, has come out, which addresses a number of issues related to Mormon history during the Civil War, and I'm hoping that this lecture will add another brick in the wall, particularly as it pertains to gathering to Zion. I thought I would just mention briefly the genesis and evolution of my studies on Mormon migration. I did my PhD on water in the Hebrew Bible and completed that dissertation at the U in 1991. and I started thinking about the cultural myopia that blurs our vision concerning who's a pioneer. I kept thinking about how many times we have Mormon historians talk about the trail, the trail, the trail, and I started thinking about the question of the sail before the trail, or have we missed the boat? So this led to the development of a database instead of writing a book, and that led to the Mormon Immigration Index CD that the LDS Church published in 2000 that went to various family history centers. And then we launched the Mormon Migration website in 2011, and that has phase 2 of the website was launched in August of 2012, and additional components also are being added. I just wanted to pause for a moment and thank, I know he's here today, Jeff Groberg, the web developer, for all the hard work, the excellent creative work he has done with this database, as well as Grant Zabriskie that couldn't be with us today, and my good friend Howard Bybee, who will be retiring in December, leaving on a mission for his help with assistance and launching this website and his insights. And so I hope that you'll take the time to go out to the website. We're now working through some paperwork, and this will be also a part of FamilySearch.org. But I just wanted to quickly show this to you, the Mormon Migration website, and I hope that you'll go and visit. Phase 2 has just been launched for 3 weeks, and I'm getting 1,500 hits a day. And so this is a great tool to search for passengers, voyages, and you can see over 1,000 first-person accounts in the 19th century alone. But returning to our topic today, I want to go back to something that Joseph Smith said shortly before the martyrdom in Carthage. Speaking to a local militia, he said, "Inasmuch as you and the people thirst for blood, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that you shall witness scenes of blood and sorrow, and many of you who are now present shall have an opportunity to face the cannon's mouth." 6 years prior to this time, Joseph also warned his friend Alexander Doniphan about God's wrath that was hanging over Jackson County. Remember, the saints were driven out of Jackson County in 1833. By 38, we have the extermination order issued by Governor Boggs. And so Joseph is talking to him about this, and I wanted to mention this because I think it plays a role in what we're going to see here today. Among other things, Joseph told him that because of the devastation that would sweep western Missouri, that only the chimneys will be left to mark the desolation. It's interesting that following the aftermath of Executive Order Number 11 by General Ewing, that's exactly what happened, specifically in the Jackson County area. Nothing left standing but the chimneys. We'll see this again with LDS as well as non-LDS accounts. For example, this Kansas soldier's view of the aftermath of the order. He mentions the border counties of western Missouri and how the chimneys mark the spot where once stood costly farmhouses. George C. Bingham, this painting that he is depicting here, would also, he would make a statement about his work that blackened chimneys standing as melancholy monuments to the devastation. Well, moving even farther back to 1832, we see that the prophet Joseph Smith had given this prophecy recorded in the Latter-day Saints Scripture, Doctrine and Covenants, in which he noted that there would be wars that would shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina. War will be poured out upon all nations beginning at this place. Note that this is nearly 3 decades before the Civil War commenced. We see also that Latter-day Saint missionaries were very keen to use this prophecy, especially when the cannons were booming. For example, Orson Pratt secured a written copy of this revelation, which he would frequently read on his missionary travels, which would take him 4,000 miles to the East Coast and up into Canada, commencing in the winter of 1832. He wrote, "I had a manuscript copy of this revelation, which I carried in my pocket." And this revelation will later be published in the Millennial Star in 1851. That's a very important year because we have more Latter-day Saints in Great Britain than we actually do in the U.S. at that time. I wanted also to say something about the extent of the prophecy. Not only is it going across the South and to the East Coast, but I found it interesting in my studies of Hawaii that we see here where the infamous Walter Murray Gibson has noted, the prophecy of Joseph Smith on the war has been published in Hawaiian and read throughout the islands, dated 1862. I might also just mention that I find it of interest that we have this revelation also published in Dutch at the time of the war down in South Africa. We also find from Wilford Woodruff in 1862, he says, "I copied a revelation more than 25 years ago in which it was stated that wars should be in the South and in the North, and that this war would commence in South Carolina, and that times should be such that every man who did not flee to Zion would take up the sword against his neighbor or brother." John McAllister, speaking of the prophecy on war, said, "Truly this is an awakening time, not only for saint, but for sinner." He went on to say that perhaps some of them will find the way to Zion to receive corn from the Joseph of the last days, playing on the idea of the Joseph that was sold into Egypt from the book of Genesis. I thought it was interesting also that Erastus Snow and Orson Pratt, who had been laboring in the East, noted that, as given in the Millennial Star, many of those who once had a standing in the church but had fallen away awakened to a sense of their position by the preaching of the elders and the events now transpiring. Every exertion is being made by the saints in that land to get away to Zion. This is significant. We're going to see that ever since the immigration commenced, coming to Utah in 47, this is going to be at an all-time high during the time of the Civil War. Over 12,000 European saints, about 5,000 coming from the East Coast and from the South. This is going to really, the Civil War, Joseph's prophecy of the devastation, the wars that would come later, was quite a sermon that would echo throughout the U.S. and Europe. Erastus Snow, writing to George A. Smith in 61, said, "We feel that our mission in the States has not been in vain, though by far the loudest sermon is being preached by him who long ago said he would come forth from his hiding place to vex the nation." This note from Orson Pratt and Erastus to Brigham Young note, again, this private correspondence. "By our testimonies and exhortations and prophesyings, together with the fearful signs of the times and the terrible forebodings of war, they have effectually aroused the gathering spirit." So we see this both publicly and privately. 11 years after the Civil War prophecy, or the prophecy on wars, Joseph stated, "I prophesy in the name of the Lord God that the commencement of the difficulties which will cause much bloodshed previous to the coming of the Son of Man will be in South Carolina. It may probably arise through the slave question. This a voice declared to me while I was praying earnestly on this subject." So this is in 43. Something that I think we really need to pay more attention to is what I refer to as the immigration revelation, to really get an understanding not only of the gathering to Zion during the Civil War period, but also the gathering in general throughout the 19th century. As Brigham was on the banks of the Missouri River in January of 1847, he received this revelation which stipulated that the Latter-day Saints should come to Zion under the direction of the 12. He noted that they should be of one heart and one mind. He also talked about how everyone should do their all in order to gather God's people. And towards the end of the revelation, he said, "Thy brethren," speaking as the voice of the Lord, "thy brethren have rejected you and your testimony, even the nation," the United States of America, that is, "that has driven you out. And now cometh the day of their calamity, even the days of sorrow, like a woman that is taken in travail. And their sorrow shall be great, unless they speedily repent, yea, very speedily. For they killed the prophets, and them that were sent unto them, and they have shed innocent blood, which crieth from the ground against them." So I think this is a significant point that the Latter-day Saints are feeling like the Civil War is a direct result behind, at least in their minds, how the saints were treated, and particularly the prophets that were martyred, Joseph and Hiram. Something that's more widely known by Latter-day Saints is this position that we see on the 4th of July in 1861, 2 months after the Civil War had broken out, in which John Taylor makes the note, "Shall we join the North to fight against the South? No. Shall we join the South against the North? As emphatically no. Why? They have both brought it upon themselves, and we have no hand in the matter. We know no North, no South, no East, and no West." In General Conference of April of 61, Brigham Young noted, "The whole government is gone. It is as weak as water. I heard Joseph say, they shall have mobbing to their heart's content if they do not redress the wrongs of the Latter-day Saints," specifically going back to the time of the Extermination Order of 38, and in which we have not only Boggs' extermination order that will cast the Mormons out of Missouri, but then later we have Joseph Smith coming with a small group to Washington, D.C., and meeting with President Van Buren and being told that their cause was just, as they had hundreds of petitions, but that he could do nothing for them. Moving ahead, according to Wilford Woodruff, Brigham Young also said, "The curse of God will be upon the nation, and they will have enough of it. The rulers possess no power in the land. They have persecuted the saints of God, and the rulers who would do nothing for us but all they could against us, and they will now get their pay for it." In contrast to what's going on in the East, we have Brigham Young writing to William Hooper, U.S. congressional delegate from the Utah Territory, "While the waves of commotion are breaking near the whole country, Utah in her rocky fortress is biding her time to step in and rescue the Constitution and aid all lovers of freedom in sustaining such laws as will secure justice and rights to all, irrespective of creed or party." In the Deseret News, we read in May of 61, "While peace reigns in Utah, civil war with all its horrors prevails among those who earnestly desire to see the soil of these valleys crimsoned with the blood of the saints." Notwithstanding these strong statements made by church leaders and printed in different LDS periodicals, we also see a different touch from Brigham Young, where he notes, "I exhort the brethren not to boast over our enemies' downfall. Boast not, brethren. God has come out of his hiding place and has commenced to vex the nation that has rejected us, and he will vex it with a sore vexation." And you'll see as the war goes on, how the saints, both leaders and the membership as a whole, are saddened by the hundreds of thousands of deaths. We also note from Brigham, "The present Constitution with a few alterations of a trifling nature is as good as we want. And if it is sustained on this land of Joseph, it will be done by us and our posterity. Our national brethren do not know how to do it." I'd like to spend 30 minutes on that and bring it to the 21st century, but I'll refrain. I also like this. I like to generate light instead of heat. and I was, this statement really caught my attention by Elder John Taylor, who later became a president following Brigham Young, president of the church, this wonderful British gentleman. Speaking of the lamentable position that was going on for those suffering due to the war in the East, Elder Taylor said, "Do we rejoice over them? No, we do not. What shall we do in the midst of these things now transpiring? Let us look to our position as elders in Israel, clothed with the holy priesthood, as men who hold the ministry of reconciliation." I think that's a great stance. But we're going to see this when the Latter-day Saints are trying to be admitted into the Union. We're going to see statements like this: we show our loyalty by trying to get into the Union while others are trying to get out of it, as we see depicted here by Hooper. It's interesting to me as well, this notion, this letter from William Hooper to Orlando Davis, Mississippi State House of Representatives, in which he writes, "I see by the telegram from Montgomery that you have formed a confederation of the succeeding states. Of all things, try to avert a civil war. Hold open the door of compromise. Be reasonable in your demands. Trust in God and to soften the hearts of men that their eyes may be open. As you allude, I have presented the Constitution of Utah with a memorial praying to be admitted into the Confederacy. This we have done for the last 5 years. A deaf ear has been turned. Where we have asked for flesh, they have given us a serpent. Again, even in the hour of trouble of our mother country, we plead for our rights and we ask admission." Now this is Orlando Davis back to William Hooper, 61. "Of one thing you may rest assured, the separation of the southern states from the north is eternal. By this I do not mean the West. If the western states will come into a government that protects and defends the institution of slavery, we desire a political connection with them." And note at the bottom here, I really love this sentence: "If we can stand your plurality wife system, you can tolerate our slavery," as the South is trying to get the saints to join with them. One of the most delightful things that I found in my study of Brigham Young correspondence was this poem written by W.W. Phelps. And as you noted at the bottom of this slide, Phelps wrote to Brigham Young, New Year's Day, 1861, "I present this hymn to you for the purpose of singing Dixie in that spirit that sounds like heaven and swells the soul to thoughts that breathe by words that burn. With sense and sound, let your children sing it, and may God grant them the music of paradise." You heard this music playing as we came in, and I would think everyone that was listening, although we didn't have the verbiage, would know from whence it came. I think it was actually 4 verses. I've just included one for sake of time. But I want you to try to get a feel of this as you think about Phelps. And again, I want to point this out. The private correspondence is where you really get at what the saints are thinking. And the fact that Phelps would present this hymn publicly, Brigham is going to say that we're for the North. The notion is we're trying to get into the Union. But there is definitely a feeling that the priesthood comes before the government that has driven the saints out. I think of this analogy of abusive mother, where the saints are loyal to the Constitution. They love their mother country. Their ancestors have fought in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. They volunteered in the Mexican War with the Mormon Battalion. But there's been a series of things, and they've sought for against them, and they've sought for redress, but to no avail. And so there's some feelings. But think about this, and I'd love if you join me in song. That's why I wanted that Dixie line. We won't do all 4, but I'm going to take a stab at it to give you a kind of a feel of this. We love the words of the prophet Joseph, while the Gentile only knows of war and woe, war and woe, war and woe. Israel reigns. Up, up, ye royal priesthood holder, Joseph's robes on Brigham's shoulders, clear the way, clear the way, clear the way. Israel reigns. For we love the light of Zion, that light, that makes us wise to win the prize. We love the light of Zion. We love, we love, we love the land of Zion. Thank you. Anyway, I think you can clearly see here that there is a feeling behind the land of Zion as it pertains to priesthood leadership and gathering to that land and sustaining it. Now, a different lens. Brigham Young told William C. Haynes, "The sympathies of our brethren are divided, some for the Union and some for the South, but the South gets the greatest share." This is, I find, fascinating, again, in private correspondence. Young told a small group assembled in the church historian's office that he did not wish Utah mixed up with the secession movement. This was probably one of the most interesting letters. We have Judah P. Benjamin, Confederate States Secretary of War, writing to Brigham Young. "It's our belief that the United States is your enemy, although we feel that together we can bring the United States to its knees." Continuing, "If we could just receive as a sign that the prophet," meaning Brigham, "in public announcement foresees at least 4 more years of struggle, this would be received with great encouragement for our cause, as well as aid the morale of our people." Don't miss the date, February 9th, 1865, 2 months before Lee would surrender at the Appomattox Courthouse. As far as private sympathies, and I emphasize the private notion here, although the issue of slavery would soon subside in Utah, the southern views from converts trickling into the Mormon region apparently did not. For example, William Preston, a convert from Virginia, would write privately to his wife Harriet after a Confederate victory he would read about, "Hurrah for Jeff and Stonewall." Interestingly enough, as a footnote, and the prominent men and women that the work for the dead was done for in 1877 by Brigham Young and others, I thought it was interesting to find the name of Stonewall Jackson as one of those individuals that caught my attention. Now, we heard about the Thomas L. Kane from Scott Duvall. Of course, Kane's papers are here. What a treasure for special collections, as well as thousands of other items. On a visit to an elderly couple living just north of Parowan, Thomas and Elizabeth Kane noticed a brilliantly colored woodcut of General Beauregard and his Confederate generals that adorned the room. The Union officer Kane then fielded eager questions asked by the elderly man, who then told of General Lee, and Stonewall Jackson simply replied, "Glory be to God." Well, I want to shift gears now to the sail rail trail aspect of our discussion. So first of all, the recommendations for saints in the east to gather to the west. Remember, they're spread out. And I might just mention this footnote. I think that one thing that Latter-day Saints, a misnomer they have as they look at the gathering, is they think mom and dad and the kids kind of all came together and they all ended up in Utah at the same time. Not so. Going back throughout the 19th century, we see people stuck in New Orleans, St. Louis, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, various areas, because they may have enough money to cross the Atlantic, but not enough money to go from the east to the west. And so they're working sometimes for weeks, months, or even years. And so sometimes the saints might get a little bit comfortable. And so the boom of the cannons is going to stir things up. And they're going to reflect on Joseph's prophecy of the war, as I mentioned earlier. Here we have Erastus Snow stating, "We recommend the saints generally in the East to gather up to the frontiers and all who can between this and the last of June." So again, this correspondence with Brigham Young. As far as gathering the saints at Council Bluffs, William Martindale states, "I feel much interested in the gathering the saints as speedily as possible, for it does seem that the cup of iniquity of this government is about full. I have raised up a branch of over 100 members. We can meet together and rejoice in the privileges of eternal life and have a joy, a Zion within our own bosoms that the world cannot give or take away." We also read of those that desired to come to Zion but didn't have the means to do so, as I mentioned earlier. The saints, too, are spirited and dutiful and desirous to obey counsel and to live according to the gospel. Their greatest desire is to gather to Zion. However, Mills writes to Young, "The means of the saints are very limited, and their desires in the respective gathering will not be accomplished as soon as they could wish. If the saints could only know how bad the Eastern saints want to go to Zion, they would do all they can to help them." John Eldridge to Brigham Young, 1861. One of the most touching accounts for me in the correspondence was reading about Agnes Campbell O'Neill that I published in BYU Studies a couple of years ago. She had come from Scotland in 45. They were stranded in St. Louis. Her husband passed away. Later she would remarry Henry O'Neill and move to Virginia. Here in a region riddled by war, Agnes wrote an emotional epistle to Brigham Young, pleading for fellowship with the Utah Saints. Among other things she wrote, "I long to breathe the mountain air of Zion's peaceful home, where free from sorrow, strife, and care, the saints of God may roam." Her spelling. "O Salt Lake City, when I think of thee, I long for pinions like the dove, that I should be so far from thee and distant from the place I love. And hope to join you soon, I say farewell. May Israel's God my path with blessings strain, guide me in safety for to gain, and bring me to Zion there to reign." Please pay particular note to this paragraph in which she pleads, "I beg the prayers of brothers and sisters and for this to be read in the church in my behalf." I love publishing this article because I know she was smiling that it made the light of day. And she says, "I pray God my eternal Father to bless the church and all the blessings, all the branches of the Latter-day Saints." Agnes O'Neill. The foreign saints were told to gather as rapidly as wisdom and circumstances will permit. We see this editorial at the end of 1860. Note, this is before the Civil War has even broken out. "All elders should understand that after baptism comes the gathering, and that everything which in the least impedes the gathering tends directly to hinder the great work in which we are engaged." I also found this to be a very, very interesting article in the Millennial Star 2 years later, or a year and a half later. The best policy for the saints to pursue. The editor writes, "At no previous time in the history of the church in Europe has there been a stronger desire manifest by the saints to gather to Zion than is exhibited the present season. There have been various causes operating to produce this anxiety, which is to be seen among the saints in every part of the land. Among these, the partial fulfillment of the revelation given to the prophet Joseph respecting the Civil War." So that's one important item. 2, deepened by the hard times and misery consequent in the country, meaning England. So you have these push and pull factors that we study as immigration historians. 3rd is, with a small amount of means to reach the place where they can be met by the oxen and wagons sent down from Zion to assist them in crossing the plains. So these, I would suggest to you, are 3 key reasons why immigration will be at an all-time high since the time the saints gathered in 1847. It would reach this peak during the Civil War because of these issues. And I'll talk more about the down and back companies briefly at the end. Again, we see in the Civil War, a month after Fort Sumter, this item. Civil War in America, its importance as a warning to the saints. The editor stressed that those gathered out west in Zion shall be the only people that shall not be at war, and that those who journeyed Zionward would be nestled in the bosom of a vast continent, far removed from the scene of strife. Well, this has become a prominent theme over the pulpit and in the periodicals. Brother Brigham said, "Had we not been persecuted, we would now be in the midst of the wars and bloodshed that are desolating the nation, instead of where we are, comfortable located in our peaceful dwellings." Elder George A. Smith, about the time that the war broke out, said, "When the saints were driven from the United States, we could not see why. But those who have any light in them can see now. If we were in Missouri, we should be obliged to take sides in the present lamentable strife of brother against brother. If we were there, we should be in constant trouble in the most awful bloodshed." On July 4th of 61, George A. also noted, Are we not thankful that at least we can see the providence of the Almighty in suffering us to be driven into these valleys where we can enjoy the sweets of true liberty, where none dare molest or make afraid? These are abundant reasons for us to be thankful. I've been studying Icelandic Latter-day Saint immigration for about a dozen years now, because my wife, back in February of 2000, read about Icelandic immigration and called me on the phone and said, "I have a feeling you're supposed to be involved in this." Well, it's been 12 years now, and I'm still involved. But I love these private letters. We found a cache of them over in Reykjavik, and in fact, I'm working now with publishing these letters. But it's very interesting, by the way, written in Icelandic. We have Loftur Jónsson writing to his friend Palk Sigurdsson. "We live here peacefully and quietly while others here in America kill and destroy one another." From one Icelander to another. National Library of Iceland, February of 1862. Well, there were challenges of leaving home and crossing the Atlantic for the European saints. The pain of leaving loved ones was paramount. One account by Caroline Anderson notes, "My heart is filled with pain when I think of those that are left in Babylon, and also that are my relatives." There were other challenges such as seasickness, disease, threats of an angry storm or an angry captain, and threat of Confederate warships. A number of vessels plied the Atlantic on 32 different voyages that crossed over during the Civil War. The Latter-day Saints had superior hygiene and order on their voyages throughout the 19th century. One example, as evidence, is Charles Dickens, who wrote, "I went on board their ship." This is the Amazon, which had over 800 saints as a footnote. This is shortly before the time of Gettysburg. "To bear testimony against them if they deserved it, as I fully believed they would. To my great astonishment, they did not deserve it. I should have said they were in their degree the pick and flower of England." I also smiled as I read this account of Captain Trask, captain of the Manchester in 1862. Elder McAllister's read Joseph Smith's views on the United States and taught some doctrine. So immediately he wants to get him up on the quarterdeck. And this is what he said. We have this little sermon. He notes, "Assembled soldiers of Zion, assemble because you are mustered. If not soldiers in reality, you are soldiers in embryo. Hence you are seed mustered. Seed of Zion, to you I would say, be strong and steadfast." This is interesting, cheering them on to victory as it's just getting ready to drop them off to go east to west through the north and south during the Civil War. Now, for the most part, the captains loved the Latter-day Saint cargo because they knew they were assured of safety, as we know that there wasn't one ship in the 19th century carrying Mormon cargo that sunk across the Atlantic. However, there were a few exceptions. One just prior to this, where Peter Gottfredson talks about how the captain had mentioned that they would have been in New York 6 weeks earlier had it not been for the Mormons, in which the reply was, if you wouldn't have had Mormons on board, Captain, you would have been in hell 6 weeks ago. We also have an interesting account where Olin Lilliquist complained about the poor provisions. 38 had died on this voyage to measles that had come, the Scandinavian saints, from Hamburg to New York in 62, at which time the captain told him that if he heard any more out of him, he'd put him in cuffs. And as a footnote, Lilliquist confided in his journal that he would have thrown him overboard had he had the chance to do so. Some of you know about the Confederate warship, the Alabama, that sunk 65 Yankee vessels. Try to get a picture of this as you look at the captain with this stogie in his hand and at what was happening as the Latter-day Saints were gathering. And you think about this account from the Hudson. Voyaging with 863 saints aboard, a Confederate warship pulled alongside the Hudson to determine what kind of freight it was transporting. The sailors aboard the warship yelled out, "Say your prayers, you Mormons, y'all going down." Fortunately, nothing came of the boastful threat. At least 2 Mormon passengers aboard the Hudson reasoned that they were spared because the passengers were from foreign countries. Now, I can't emphasize enough. In fact, I have a book in me. I've done a book chapter, but I have a book in me on Men in Motion, I'm going to call it, The Mormon Immigration Agents, by sail, rail, and trail. What an important role that they played in various aspects of the Mormon migration without pay. These unsung heroes working under the direction of the brethren under covenant. It's interesting, if we just go back a few years, 5 years before the Civil War, we're going to see this kind of correspondence that I've been looking at now for a little over a decade. We see John Taylor to Franklin D. Richards. Richards in Liverpool, John Taylor, New York, he's citing a letter from Brigham Young that was sent to each of them. They had this incredible web of networking. Whenever you ship a company, whether it be small or large, be careful to forward to John Taylor at New York a correct list of names, occupations, right? Counsel them immediately on landing as to the best course, whether to tarry for a season to work in the place or immediate neighborhood of their landing or to proceed. So much is going on at these different points along the way. Now you can see here the primary sea routes of the Latter-day Saints from the 61 to 64. The war is over by April of 65. But you can see the main port of embarkation is going to be Liverpool. And throughout the 19th century, the Saints are going to be commencing with 1850 when the gospel comes to Copenhagen, with coming over to Liverpool via Hull and Grimsby. In 62, we have this period here, we have them starting to come through Hamburg because we think it was tough because of the war to have vessels. Now, it's interesting, too, that Brigham Young's decision in 54 changed the primary port of arrival from New Orleans to the East Coast. We have 3 voyages coming into Boston, 29 into New York, but because of Castle Garden Depot, which is the pre-Ellis Island, that's going to trump Boston or Philadelphia. So we had this letter written in 54 where Brigham writes to Franklin D. Richards, ship no more to New Orleans, Philadelphia, Boston, or ship no more to New Orleans, but ship to Philadelphia, Boston, New York, giving preference to the order named. So here's Castle Garden that was used by about 65,000 of our ancestors during the 19th century. Now, when the war breaks out, shifting back to the Civil War, we have this immigration agent in New York, Nathaniel Very Jones, who also served in the Mormon Battalion. We have interesting accounts as the Saints are landing. I like this one from Eli Wiggle coming from South Africa, 32 Saints on the ship Racehorse, which included smuggling this African boy named Gobo Fango, that's for another hour lecture. But as he comes in, he says it was all commotion with bands of music, fife and drum, and recruiting parties and flags flying in every direction. I also came across this interesting letter from William Staines to Brigham Young. Staines was also assisting with immigration here in 63. The Amazon passengers have just left the gardens, meaning Castle Garden. They go to the railroad depot by boat instead of passing through the city so that we would not cause any excitement for the people who were amongst the mob last week to not feel very calm. Over 10,000 troops are in the city with artillery. So again, the private correspondence is giving us a look behind the lines. We're going to see things like this from various accounts, these 32 voyages. The beauty of the Mormon migration, my favorite part, is that you have scores and scores and scores of accounts from these 32 voyages that are giving us a picture of the European view of Latter-day Saints that are passing through, going east to west to north and south during the Civil War, and what they have to say about how they're met at the various places they're entering into, whether that's a port or a post. Here we have with New York and Florence being mentioned. We also wanted to point out the rail travel. You see this shot normally over to Chicago, down into Quincy on the CBQ Railroad, and then heading down and over to on the St. Joe and Hannibal Railroad, as you see right here coming across to St. Joe during this time period. And here we have, this is what George Buchanan, an immigration agent, suggested to Brigham, and it was a 207-mile ride. They didn't have much of a problem going from New York to Chicago. In 62, they went into Canada because it was cheaper, and then later in 64, some of them went there because of the outbreak of the war. But New York to Chicago and then down on the CBQ wasn't much of a problem. But when they went across Missouri, it was high adventure. You see things like this from Brigham Young's correspondence with George Buchanan about immigration. In regard to this season's immigration, it will be necessary for you to be constantly and carefully watch the political horizon. If the signs of the times indicate the beginning of war between England and the northern states, previous to the usual time of our immigrants leaving Liverpool, it will be best for the brethren to use every exertion to make their escape to some port in the States or Canada, which I noted they did. They also traveled in cattle cars, even though they were packed like beasts, and as William Wood said, we could smell and taste hog for 2 or 3 days and afterwards, and there was nothing but straw to sit on, according to Mary Davis. It was actually safer because there were times that the Union soldiers would be sitting in the front as cannonballs were whizzing over their heads as they were trying to pass through Missouri because of the Quantrill Raiders with these Confederate attacks. An 1862 immigrant account of the trek through Missouri, Joseph Rich recalled, presented a mournful picture. In many places, houses were burned down, fences destroyed, crops unattended. All the bridges were well guarded by Union troops to prevent the secessionists from burning them. The fulfillment of Joseph Smith's prophecies concerning Missouri can be visibly seen in passing through the states. That's an interesting point there that we see reoccurring. William Freshwater remembered, just before we arrived in St. Joe, Missouri, the rebels or bushwhackers fired 2 cannonballs through our train. One shot went through the passenger car exactly 8 inches above the people's heads, and the other through a baggage car, destroying a great amount of baggage. I can truly say I saw little of the war between the North and the South. The boom of cannons we're going to see over and over again. Shutters were up at the window, and the people on the trains were asked to be very quiet. When we passed through Missouri, the people were very bitter against the Mormons and set a bridge on fire to retard our progress. Mary Webb remembered that there was a Dutch sister in St. Joe who was stolen by the soldiers, but fortunately retrieved by the elders. Thomas Henry Wright wrote of his company encounter with soldiers while crossing Missouri at St. Joe. At every station, the soldiers would ask, "When are those Mormons coming through?" No one seemed to know. This was during the time of the Rebellion War. The immigrants were in danger, especially the boys, of being drafted into the army. I'm going to just kind of skip through some of these for sake of time. I talked about how some of them had to go into Canada. It was cheaper and also a bit safer at times. But again, as we come into Florence, we're going to see things like this. We heard the cannons of the Civil War while we were at Florence, or another immigrant account. Although Florence was some distance from roaring cannons and shooting guns, the people were in a state of excitement and confusion. We also see the Mormons running into the Josephites, those that were members of the RLDS Church, now known as the Community of Christ, that warned them of what would happen if we went to Utah and did not do what we were told. One of my very favorites is Amos Milton Musser, who wrote that the apostates are becoming as thick in this country as the lice were in Egypt in the days of Pharaoh. Well, that's 1857, and what's really interesting to me is that I found evidence in correspondence that one of the main reasons why they're going to move the Frontier Outfitting Post from Florence, Nebraska, down to Wyoming, Nebraska, 45 miles south, is because the brethren did not want the negative apostate influence affecting these new converts coming in from the British Isles and from Scandinavia. Other factors were the railroad, the distance of steamboat, and interestingly enough, I wanted to point out Judge Kenny of Utah will send a letter to Brigham Young that seems to be the genesis for all of it. Not only immigrants on the East Coast at New York, but Joseph W. Young will be an agent at Wyoming, Nebraska, and will have a variety of responsibilities we see here depicted that will keep him very busy. Brigham Young said to his nephew, "I trust that you will always and fully express to me your views upon any and every subject of importance in your official operations." There continue to be problems with soldiers. I want to point out very clearly that if you read the accounts in the early 60s, you will see that the Mormons feared the soldiers more than they did the Indians. And it's very interesting to see some of the things that transpired there in this way. On occasion, soldiers searched the immigrating saints for gunpowder and even forced some of them to alter their journey and backtrack to Fort Bridger, where they were made to swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution before being allowed to continue on to Utah. I don't have time to do this justice, but the down and back trains, one of my colleagues, Emeritus BYU Professor Bill Hartley, has written on this, has done an excellent job, but I just wanted to mention that they're moving from hand carts in the early years, during the Civil War years, they're going to use what's called the down and back trains because they had a surplus of oxen. And so what's going to happen is these young men are going to get the keys to Dad's car or the wagon. They're going to get out of farm work. They're going to be able to meet the beautiful Scandinavian babes coming in from afar. And it's going to cut the price down of things. It's going to up the amount of people that want to travel to Zion. But this had a significant impact. The down and back companies that went from the Salt Lake Valley, Utah region out to the Missouri River and back in to shepherd the people in. So in conclusion, about 12,000 European saints embarked for Utah during the Civil War years, and about another 5,000 from North America, revealing that immigration to Zion rose to an all-time peak from the time that the saints started coming to Utah in 1847. The saints who came to the Salt Lake Valley during the Civil War had come face to face with the Lord's promise to Brigham Young as outlined in the immigration revelation. "Fear not thine enemies, for they shall not have power to stop my work. Fear not thine enemies, for they are in mine hands, and I will do my pleasure with them." In 1842, Joseph Smith had proclaimed, "No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Armies may assemble, calumny may defame, but the truth of God will go forth." The courage and determination of these gathering saints, passing through the fires of the calamitous American Civil War, put flesh and blood behind Joseph's bold declaration. Thank you. Please.
Is there more written than by William Hartley on the down and back trains? Is that a book?
Yeah, there was an article done years ago in BYU Studies. If you just look under William G. Hartley, and he also has a chapter in that Civil War Saints book I mentioned that recently came out. He's very good with the trail. I kind of focus more on the sail before the trail or have we missed the boat. And so, very good. Anyone else, any questions from the audience? Please, from the back, I met this gentleman earlier. Is it Robbie?
Robert, yeah.
Okay.
Question about the correspondence between, you were talking about when it said Brigham Young, you said that among the brethren, I guess more for the South. Was that more for, was it more of a field for states' rights rather than pro-slavery? It was pro-states' rights versus, like for the state to decide rather than, was it a more political thing rather than a single issue?
It's both, and someone should do a book on the correspondence if they only looked at, see what we have, it's been published, Brigham Young's outgoing correspondence is available, but the incoming hasn't been done, and that's at least, I mean, that's the other half. But just between John Bernheisel, that's serving in D.C., and Brigham Young, scores and scores of letters, you're going to get more of a political flavor. But you also have the correspondence between the agents, which is very, very important, of this sail rail trail. It's very intricate. Brigham is always on top of things. I'm working now with putting together an exhibit at Promontory Point on Brigham Young's role in the railroad with Mormon immigration. And I can tell you, as early as 47, they were looking for places to lay the track out. Brigham Young was one of the very first people to buy stock on the Union Pacific. But he was the American Moses. And the track record, it's incredible. 350 settlements, 86% were successful. And so, anyway, it's quite a story, the gathering in general. But my favorite part is the Civil War. I mean, what a great movie. Just think about this for a minute, of picturing, a Confederate vessel in the sea, or soldiers trying to steal Scandinavian women, checking them for gunpowder, making them swear an oath of allegiance to the Constitution, cannonballs flying over their heads as Quantrell and these Confederate raiders are trying to go after them. It's an incredible piece of Mormon history that I don't think has been treated, and that's why instead of writing an article, I'm now in the process of writing a book just on this particular topic. So Scott, I think we're out of time, but again, I'll be happy to visit with you one-on-one over, I hope you'll see the exhibit. It's wonderful. Already 3,000 people have come through, and I hope that another 300,000 will follow shortly thereafter. Thank you again, Scott. I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Thank you.